I don't know. Another question that came up that we didn't ask, it was brought forward by a town department, or the water department, and they have a question. They're going to look at the difference, if any, of shutting down all of the leaching fields in Madaket. In layman's terms, from as we understand it, what was said was there's a very thin aquifer in Madaket. And currently everybody's wells obviously are in that aquifer. And
You mean a thin layer between the ground level and the water?
and the salt water below it.
No, the fresh water.
The fresh water, between the fresh water, the land, yes,
Okay.
right.
The thin freshwater aquifer actually sits above a saltwater bubble.
That's correct. But
Right.
the point is, that's not the point, though. The point is that there's not a whole lot of dirt or sand between ground level.
Well, no, that isn't the point. The water department is looking at, if you take the downward pressure from leaching fields, which is currently holding the salt water down, and you take that pressure off, does the salt water come up, and does it squeeze the aquifer so that your well points will now be drawing brackish water because the water table is not as thick?
But you already have water, town water.
No,
we don't
this
have
is
town
and this is the water department's question, is there's already town water out there, but it hasn't been extended to all of Madaket. So they may in fact have to revamp their process, and they're looking into it. They actually brought the question up.
We've been trying to get water, for example, on Midland and several other small streets. That project had been approved and funded in the last budget, and it was supposed to happen this spring and didn't. So when it didn't, we went to the water company and say, hey, when's the project happening? They said, wait a minute, we want to wait to sewers, see what happens. And the exact quote is, if I may, in
This is
terms
from
of
Bob
brackish
Gardner?
water,
Yeah.
it says, it's a very distinct possibility of the wells becoming brackish, and it is an issue that needs to be looked at, as it could have an impact on the future extension of the water system. So it's a question we'd like to have investigated prior to the vote.
Well, actually, the water department is going to do it. They told the selectmen that they are going to be researching it, and our question is, well then, you know, they seem to be able to have this information for the annual. They certainly can't get it for the special.
How many of the homes in this sewerage area, proposed sewerage area, would that issue impact?
It's a good question, Dan, and just in my neighborhood, on 2.5 short streets, it would affect just 50 houses in that small area of Madaket. On top of that,
Do those wells already have issues with brackishness?
some of them do and some of them don't, which is why they would like to have water now. And part of the reason that the water company is taking a time out is that in order to run down some of these very small streets, you need easements. They're private streets. Well, if the town's going to run sewer, we can piggyback on their easements, which is a good idea. The other thing is some of these roads are only 10 feet wide on the traveled way. And when you run a water line with nothing else there, you just run it. But if there's a sewer there, you're required to have a 10-foot separation. So they need to know, is the sewer going in or is it not going in? So they're holding up. And it's an important question to investigate.
We also have concerns about density changes, which PASS is saying there's no problem, zoning will protect you. And there's a lot of doubt in quite a few people's minds just how accurate that is. And we're saying between now and the annual, you know, which is actually what our article is to form a workshop of town officials and citizens to delve into these things and have a group work with PASS to, because Andrew has said that you know, there's some tweaking that can be done to Madaket. We have to ask for it, and so we don't quite know what that is, and we need time to do that, and we need to have this in place before you know, this all happens.
And one of the comments, Dan, that was made was, why do we need another work group? We had one for the sewers, and it worked very hard for a couple of years. Well, the reason we need this work group to help answer these questions is The prior work group was charged by the town with one mission: figure out how to finance this one. They were not charged with determining which properties are or are not in the sewer district, or dealing with any of these density or zoning issues.
How was this dealt with for the article that was presented and passed at the annual town meeting last April with respect to the sewering of Monomoy and the harbor and so forth? Weren't these same issues all on the table then? Did they deal with them or not?
They may have been on the table, but the residents of that area or the civic groups in that area perhaps did not take the same path we're taking by asking more questions. There's no question that we need to address protecting the eelgrass, the groundwater, and the water table and the watershed. There's no question that sewers are a decent and probably good answer. They're expensive, and there are other ways to do this less expensively that ought to be examined that have not yet been examined, and we're just asking for a couple of months.
What do you think are the other ways to do this that would be less expensive?
Well, I'll give you an example. Right now, we have been measuring the TDML of nitrogen in several locations. The trend has
Who's
been...
we? Who's we?
The town.
The town, okay.
The trend has been very good, for the most part, in our area, Madaket. Those numbers in recent years, we would like to see plugged into the model that was used a number of years ago and updated to measure the success of all of the things we've been trying to do. Mining the landfill, testing the septic systems, forcing people to try to repair their septic systems. How are we doing? Let's measure that. If the threshold is 0.45 milliliters and we're at 0.48, and at one point we were below, it would indicate that the steps we are taking are making progress. If the intent is to reduce the level from 0.45 to 0, that's not possible. But there are alternate technologies that are available and approved in Massachusetts that might help some of the low-lying areas. For example, when we're not bringing the sewer across Hither Creek to that area that you displayed, maybe they should be included, but maybe they should be included to the point that we help them with an alternate tank added onto their septic system that would help reduce the nitrogen flow into the harbor.
Is that a proper charge to the taxpayers?
That's not a determination for me.
Well, what do you think?
Well, we think that it's part of the due diligence. You're talking about helping the funding?
Helping a private individual, instead of hooking them up to the sewer system at twice the cost or whatever it is. But under the present mentality, any improvement that a homeowner makes himself, he pays for.
Oh, absolutely.
So
let's examine that a second. The Board of Health has a mechanism for those people.
I understand that, but basically they have to pay for it.
Right.
There's a
Initially.
financing, then there's financing, they
Right.
pay for it.
Right.
It's their cash outlay. And
Is there a way to help them? Maybe.
should the taxpayers, if this is something that is ultimately agreed upon, that dealing with some of these people at least, who are not in the district and should be dealt with, is that a legitimate call on the taxpayer?
So good point. And part of the discussion when somebody asked about tight tanks, the response from the town was it'd be if you can get them as an approved mechanism through the state, and there are areas of Island besides Smith's Point that have tight tanks. But the thought process was, well, it's going to be very prohibitive cost for the town we're going to have to buy extra trucks, we're going to have staff. Well, no one said that the town should be picking that cost up. You know, that was a statement or an assumption made by, whether it be the consultants or someone. No one has said that the town should bear the cost of that. You know, the process may very well be that those technologies are available. It's a requirement to do that, and the homeowner has to pick up the cost of having
But that's really unfair, isn't it?
for the homeowner to do it?
Yeah, because if the sewers went out there, the town taxpayers would pay for.
You're asking
Well-
another question that we need to examine in this interim period.
And you actually asked for both sides of it. You asked, is it fair for the town to be picking up for these improvements? Or is it fair for the homeowner to have to do the improvements
Same
if sewer is
question,
coming
same
up?
question,
From a
different,
purely
phrased differently.
dollar standpoint, if we're gonna spend $120,000 per property to sewer it, and you can accomplish the same or near the same thing for substantially less than that, we should know that, and maybe the taxpayers will say, hey, instead of me funding $120,000 for 15 properties each out there, and we can get away with it for $60,000, let's think about that. It may be less expensive to the taxpayer, or there may be another way, incentives from the state, incentives from the federal government, to make those improvements. We just need a couple of months to examine that.
No, I don't, well, I'm not going to argue with you. I think
Right.
that there has to be a will on the part of the town officials and the voters to help individuals with their private
You won't get any
improvements.
argument
No.
from me on
Yeah.
that.
And the
Ken.
town meeting vote, last town meeting, did do that. Where they
With
spread it.
the sewers, but I'm
Right.
talking about each, if you have your own separate system.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I mean, but that may be the
point-
process.
I think the point of all this is that there are a lot of unanswered questions.
Absolutely.
Are they enough to stop the process at this point? That's something.
Well, it
not
isn't
asking-
stopping the process.
We're not asking to stop the process. We're asking for a hiatus of 5 months so these issues can be addressed. That doesn't mean, Dan, that the design process, which takes over a year just to get to a bid point, it doesn't mean that the design process can't begin.
How much is the design process costing?
Right now, the estimate, and it's very high, it's over an 11% design fee. The budget calls for just the
So-
Madaket portion to be $6.1 million. The rate of burn for a design process, they're not going to spend $6 million in 4 or 5 months getting the design process commenced.
But why spend it all at all if you're going to ultimately deep six the project?
Well, no one's saying
We
deep
don't
six
want
it,
to deep six the
Well, if you don't
project
want to deep six it, why not go ahead with it now?
because
there's too many questions.
they can still go ahead with
I mean,
starting the
it-
design, but there's other things that need to be answered, which we've gone over.
Which would determine ultimately the vote on the question. The
Well-
answers to those
Well,
questions.
I don't think it would determine the vote. I think
Well,
it
then
would
why,
allow-
that's my point. Why,
I
if it
think
doesn't,
let me finish. I think it would allow the voters to cast a more informed vote. It's not going to make the vote. It's going to allow the voters to be more informed about what they're voting on.
it doesn't, we can keep arguing this.
Okay.
No, yeah.
It doesn't matter. But anyway, gentlemen, thank you for sharing your views with us. I think it's, you can't argue with your points. I'm not trying to argue with them. I just think it's a question of whether the answer to those questions, and this is what the voters at special town meeting will have to decide, whether the answers to those questions are sufficiently important to delay the process.
Well, to paraphrase Cy Sims, a clothing guy on the mainland, where an educated consumer is his most important product. We think an educated voter is the best person to go to town meeting, and that's what we're striving for.
Bill Greeter,
Thank
Bruce
you.
Mandel, thank you.
Thank you, Dan.